The night lay silent on June Carter Street as the shadow moved through the woods. The wind blew gently, bending the flowers in Mrs. Johnson's garden. Theirs was the last house on the street. The house had been uninhabited for years before the Johnsons bought it. Mr. Johnson had been quite happy buying the house at a cheap price. He had given the realtor a generous tip. The shadow moved towards the house, called by the movie Mrs. Johnson watched in the living room. Outside the house, the street lay quiet. The neighbor's dog cowered in fear. The animal could sense the dark presence settle around them. It was happening again. It was happening because nobody warned them. The neighbors had watched the Johnsons move into the house, but nobody warned them about the events that usually took place in it. The shadow moved through the woods and stopped by the trunk of the tree next to the house. From there, it watched the house in silence. The streetlight cast its beam around the street, but its light went nowhere near the woods. The wind began to blow slightly harder as the shadow began to move with it, a mist moving under the cover of the dark. The street lights went off as it drew near the house. In the living room, Mrs. Johnson watched the movie she had seen in the basement. She had found it while cleaning the basement the day after they moved in. She turned towards the stairs. "Evelyn, could you please check the food on the fire?" she called. The shadow moved through the boundary wall to the walls of the house. From there, it stared at Mrs. Johnson through the living room window. There was something similar about the movie she was watching. The house looked the same with the one she was in. She watched on, looking closely as the camera panned to show someone peeping into the house in the movie. Mrs. Johnson turned towards the living room window in time to see a shadow move across it. She stood to her feet. The movie was beginning to seem real and it scared her. She had to turn it off before things got weird. Walking towards the television, a disfigured face suddenly appeared on screen with a devilish smile. She stepped back, gasping. Two hands came out of the screen to the side of the television, holding it as the creature dragged itself out. Mrs. Johnson shrieked in terror as the lights went off. She began walking backwards to the door. Lightning struck, lighting the living room, followed by the rumble of thunder. The creature was no more. Mrs. Johnson looked around her in fear. She was just being paranoid. She tried to convince herself. It was just a movie. Lightning struck again as she turned to face the door. Before her stood the creature she had seen crawl out of the television. She screamed in terror, but her scream did not last long. She fell down to the floor, a body of charred flesh. Mr. Johnson was on his way out of his study when he heard his wife scream. He stepped back to his study table and reached underneath it for the gun he usually kept there. With it in his hand, he stepped out of his study. He saw the creature as it stood next to his wife's dead body. He raised the gun and fired at it. The bullet passed through the creature and hit the living room wall. The creature turned towards him, a scarred face and bruised limbs masked by the shadows that wrapped it in. Mr. Johnson heard Rita's voice. He heard her cry as she did on the night of her death. "You left me to die," Rita cried. "Daddy, you left me to die." He lowered his gun, crying as he saw Rita walk towards him. He fell on his knees apologizing. It began to rain outside as the creature walked to Mr. Johnson. It got to him and tore his head off his shoulders with one quick swipe. Blood splattered on the walls as his body fell headless to the floor. His head rolled down the hallway before stopping by the stairs. Evelyn had been helping Sam with his assignment when her mother called her. She was leaving his room when the lights went off. She had gone back into Sam's room to get her phone when she heard her mother scream. She hid Sam in the closet and waited quietly. A few minutes later, she heard the sound of her father's gun. She had to find out what was happening. She tiptoed to the bedroom door and opened it. She peered down the stairs but didn't hear any movement. She gradually descended the stairs, hoping that nothing evil had happened. Evelyn saw her father's headless body lying in the hallway and the creature kneeling beside him. She screamed. Her scream echoed round the house as the creature stood and ran through her, ripping her heart out. Evelyn fell to her knees before rolling down the stairs to the floor dead. On the stair railing, her fingernails could be seen, scratching the railing as she climbed up. She opened the bedroom door and entered. From his hiding place in the closet, Sam could see the torn black jeans and the long black leather jacket. As the creature walked into the room, it walked round the room searching for him, and then it walked out of the room, closing the door behind it. Sam sighed as he held onto the flashlight that Evelyn had left with him. Beside him in the closet, he suddenly heard a voice sing, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." With shaky hands, Sam turned on the flashlight and cast its beam to the side. The beam rested on a creature's face as it sat next to him. It smiled, a disfigured face with a set of discolored teeth. Puff, the creature said, and the flashlight went off. Sam's scream was the last thing that was heard. Lena Holmes, a model, was offered a part in a movie, and she found stardom. As is common, fame and fortune can make significant changes in a person's personality. So it was with Lena Holmes. She became difficult to work with and bullied everyone with who she worked. Lena wanted her body from her face to her toes perfect, so she hired a chemist to create shampoo, creams for her face, her neck, her arms, and every other place where skin could be seen. Once a week, Lena went to an upscale beauty salon to have her hair shampooed by Carol, the only person she would allow near her hair. "Miss Holmes, I don't understand it. I poured some of your special shampoo on your hair, but it won't lather. It's as though I just poured water on your hair." "What?" Lena growled, jumped out of the chair, wrapped a towel around her head, rushed to her car, and drove to her chemist. When she arrived at the chemist's lab, she barged in startling Dr. Fine. "You're a fraud, a charlatan. I paid you a fortune for this shampoo, and it doesn't lather," she screamed, pointing the bottle at his face. Lena walked back and forth in front of the chemist, who sat at his desk and watched her as she paced and ranted. "Oh, if I had a gun. Miss Holmes, I don't appreciate your insults or your threats. I should kick you out of here right now. But I won't. I don't know what went wrong with the formula, but I'll find out. Now, leave and don't come back." "I won't, you crook. I ought to sue you," she growled and stormed out of his lab. Miserable bitch. Spoiled brat. I want to be around when age turns her into a prune. I want to see her fall apart. Now let's look at the shampoo, he said, and put a drop on a glass slide and looked at it through his microscope. "Interesting. One element has degraded. I can fix it," he said, went to his refrigerator and took out a jar, removed the cap, and poured about an ounce into the shampoo. Next, he went to his incubator and took out a small bottle that was filled with green liquid and went to his workplace. He held the small bottle up to the light and smiled. "I wish I could be there to see it," he said, took the cap off the bottle of shampoo and poured the contents of the small bottle into it. Then he screwed the cap back on the bottle of shampoo, shook it several times, and held the bottle up to the light. "Yeah, I'd love to see this." The shampoo was delivered the next morning. "Good. Just in time. I have an appointment to have my hair washed." In order to be sure that her hair was receiving the attention she demanded, she went to her exclusive beauty salon. "Miss Holmes, how nice to see you. Come with me and I'll wash your hair." "Here's my shampoo, Carol," she said, and gave her the bottle. Lena sat in the shampooing chair and put her head back on the contoured sink. Carol wet her hair, poured some of Lena's shampoo on her head, and massaged her head. "Is this new shampoo? The suds are luxurious, so smooth." Carol rinsed her hair, covered her hair with a towel, and led her to a chair. "How would you like me to style your hair?" "Just take about a half-inch off the bottom." After Carol finished, she used mirrors to show Lena what she did. "Looks fine. Thank you, Carol," she said, paid her, left the salon, and went home. It was late, so she made herself a sandwich, watched TV for a while, and then went to bed. She was very tired, so she fell right to sleep. During the night, she tossed and turned. After tossing and turning for 4 hours. She suddenly awoke, looked at her hands in sheets and blanket, and saw that they were covered with blood. "Oh my God, what's happening?" she moaned and put her hands to her head. "My head's bleeding," she gasped and fainted. While she was unconscious, microscopic parasites, which Dr. Fine put in her shampoo, crawled through her hair, eating her hair as they went. After her hair was gone, they burrowed into her scalp. By morning, the parasites had burrowed into her scalp, eaten her brain, and moved through her body, eating as they went. Medical examiners, after they performed an autopsy and finally discovered the cause of her death, agreed that there was no way of knowing how she became a host for the parasites. The cottage was made of stone and log, with a thatch roof, and never a day went by without it being warm. That was her father's doing, and Trudeau loved her father, Martin, dearly. Her mother, Meredith, she tried to love, but that woman was distant, some might say cold. She was more often than not having hateful thoughts toward her. Meredith was barren, and Trudeau took the blame for that. Her mother had referred to her in secret as a witch since her birth, and it was her father's rationality over religion, which some called blasphemy, that had them relocate when Trudeau was 10. He built the cottage from the ground up, collected the animals, and grew what he could so they could eat. The winters were cold, but the remaining seasons were wonderful. Trudeau was allowed to wander where she pleased, except for in the woods. She had only done it once and wasn't there for long, not even lost. Her father found her catatonic and staring skyward. When he touched her shoulder, she shrieked so loudly, it caused a ringing in his left ear, which would nag him for the rest of his days. What she had seen she could not remember. "Those woods are alive, and not in a good way," her father said. "They will gobble you up, my child. Not even I want to go there." It was 1646, Virginia, in the New World. Trudeau was born here, and her mother and father rarely spoke of their voyage. All she knew was that it had been cold, wet, rough, and a lot of people died. Martin had tried not to doubt God's plan, but some knew that he did. Trudeau had just turned 15, was raven-haired, blue-eyed, at a good age for marriage, but she refused the idea, and her father joked that she was a little old woman in herself. He wanted grandsons, and there were many eligible Christian boys in town, just 6 miles away. Her mother told her that witches and whores never marry. Things at the cottage changed after her mother went missing. Trudeau stayed there, by the fire, while her father followed her mother's footprints toward the woods. He was gone for the night, and she was too terrified to sleep, not even the scriptures bringing comfort. On the second day he returned carrying Meredith in his arms. "Cover your mother's nakedness," he said, exhausted, Trudeau at the ready with a blanket. At dusk, as her mother slept, Trudeau saw the jackalope, the horned one, scurry across the yard. She told her father, but he angrily dismissed her as having a madness, like her mother. Never had he spoken to her like that. For the first time she had a hateful thought toward him. Soon, the hens had stopped laying, the cows were dry of milk, the horses died, and the grain stores were developing rot. Mist hung low in the morning, and Martin crawled over his sleeping wife, climbing from their bed. He dressed himself, instead of waking Trudeau to help him. Then he noticed wet footprints, which seemed to manifest by themselves, upon the stone floor in the middle of the room. They hadn't been there a moment ago. Meredith murmured in her sleep. He followed the footprints to the main door. Slowly, he opened it, and now saw hoof prints. He followed them to the middle of the yard, to where they vanished amidst the mist. "There's the devil in my house," he said to himself, horrified. In a fit of rage, driven by terror, he stormed inside, dragging Trudeau from her bed. She screamed as he threw her from the cottage. He forced her to look at the hoof prints and dragged her by her hair to where they ended. She saw no hoof prints. "This is your doing," he yelled at her. "Your mother always said you were a witch. You said you saw the jackalope." "I'm not a witch," Trudeau yelled back. "You're as mad as she is. She was lost in the woods, not me. I see no hoof prints, and so of the jackalope." "Explain this." "I've never been lost in the woods. You said the woods gobble things up." He grabbed Trudeau by her hair again and dragged her kicking and screaming to the woodpile, yanking the axe from the chopping block. He placed the cold, sharp edge of it to her forehead. "If you're a witch, I will split your skull," he roared. "No, father. I'd rather you banished me now, and I will hunt you with my axe." From inside the cottage, they heard Meredith scream. Martin threw the axe down. Trudeau grabbed the axe and tossed it away. "They'd both gone mad," she wept, getting to her feet. She followed her father inside. Meredith writhed in agony in the bed, Martin trying to comfort her. She pushed suddenly, as if in labor, then relaxed and sighed, falling back into a deep sleep. He threw back the covers. Behind him, Trudeau gasped, covering her mouth. Resting on the sheet between her mother's legs, in a small pool of blood, was a black hen's eggs, warm and hard as stone. "I told you," Truda hissed. There's your witch. Quiet, Martin ordered. I must get rid of this. Take it back to from where it came. The devil is in my house. I trust neither of you. This is what I get for doubting God's plan. Later, when the mist had lifted, Truda watched her father take the egg to edge of the woods and bury it. She was having hateful thoughts, her scalp still burning. Truda was asleep and her mother was watching her. It was a misty dawn the following day. Meredith disrobed and in a trance slowly turned. She went naked through the cottage to the door and into the yard. She could hear a baby crying near the woods. As she crossed the fields, the mist parted for her, and the crying led her to a spot in the ground. She fell to her knees and started digging. The closer she got to it, the crying intensified, and then there it was, the black egg. It was still warm, hard as stone. She rubbed it against her cheek and cooed, "My little one, it will be all right. Mother will take you home." A weight exploded through her head, blinding her, and she felt it again, convulsing now, the egg cracking, spilling blood onto the soil to mix with her own. Martin held the axe, looking down at her. It was an effortless kill. Convinced the witch was dead, the curse would be lifted, the rot would be removed from the grain, and the livestock would produce again. He reburied the pieces of egg and grabbed dead Meredith by an arm and dragged her into the woods. Her burial would have to be done before Truda awoke. She was not to see this. Back at the cottage, still in her bed, Truda cried out, arching her back in pain, having a seizure. It only lasted a moment, and she fell back into a deep sleep. Martin was washed and sitting by the fire reading the scriptures. It was close to midday and Truda was wide awake now. "I've slept too long, Father," she said. "I apologize for my laziness. Shall I check for an egg?" He scowled at her. "Is that an attempt at humor, my daughter? This is not a day for laughter. It is a day for mourning. Your mother has died, and at dawn was buried." Truda was lost for words and went into the yard. The day was warm. Her mother was dead, and she felt nothing. She could see no sign of a grave, and the axe was missing. She ran back into the cottage and asked, "Where's the axe, Father?" Martin had it resting across his lap, the book of scripture tossed on the floor. "It's right here, my daughter," he said, with a crazed look in his eye, "safest in my hands." "Where's Mother buried?" "In the 5 points of the woods, as she wished, when she whispered it in my bad ear while I slept." "You're a madman." Truda dashed for the door and Martin chased her. He couldn't believe how nimble she was on her feet. She ran in the direction of the town, 6 miles away, and only looked back once to see her father collapse to his knees, exhausted, pointing the axe at her. He cried out, but she was too far away to hear what he said. At dusk, she entered the town and requested to meet with the magistrate. Her request was granted, but only for a moment. He was an elderly man, easily prone to superstition. "What counsel do you seek, young woman?" he asked. "I know you by your parents. Your father is a doubter. Speak quickly. My father has gone mad and murdered my mother. He is on his way here now. I'd like to testify to witchcraft." "Witchcraft? That's a confronting testament to make against one's kin. What proof have you?" Truda reached into her apron pocket. On the magistrate's desk, she placed a black hen's egg, warm and hard as stone.